This interview with Steve Hackett is brought to you by Make a Difference with Records. We are a vinyl charity store based in Godalming, and we support the Surrey mental health charity Catalyst. Look out for our other podcasts, and you can follow us on Instagram under Make a Difference with Records or on Twitter at Vinyl for Charity. So my name's Anthony from Make a Difference with Records, and I'm lucky enough today to be here with Steve Hackett. Steve, thanks for having me along today.
Nice to talk to you, Anthony. All the best.
Thank you. So, preparing for this interview was more difficult than I thought, because I've followed your career since since your solo career began, having first got into Genesis with Trick of the Tail. And then I kind of reminded myself, well, I'm not here as a fan today, I'm here on behalf of Make a Difference with Records. Right. And I was therefore thinking, well, actually, what would be the most appropriate thing to talk to you about? Also recognising that you're very accessible as a musician. You've done a lot of interviews, and I know you get asked the usual questions about leaving Genesis and all that kind of stuff. But I wanted to start today talking a little bit about your book, A Genesis in My Bed, because a lot's been written about you. But when I read the book, the one thing that struck me is that you don't just confine it obviously to your musical career. There's a lot of a story about you as an individual and your own personal journey through someone who grew into confidence in the band, Foxtrot Selling England, then solo career, rebuilding confidence, and so on and so forth. What made you want to tell that part of your story?
Well, you know, most autobiographies do tend to, obviously it all starts young, born at a very young age and all the rest, and then people become more successful, and then it becomes a who's who of whoever they've worked with, etc. And I was out last evening with Madonna, darling, and it was truly scrumptious.
Is that
wonderful.
True?
No, it wasn't. I'm saying most people, you know, heading towards that, and then it becomes a who's who. And funny enough, it was Joe who said to me, "Yeah, it normally just ends up with, you know, this kind of, you know, a who's who and a kind of, you know, yes, wouldn't I like to have that address book? Yes, you know." Winston Churchill, followed by etc., etc., etc. I thought there are other things that motivate me, and I like to think that there is a life outside music, and it's probably got to do with, well, in a way, it's got to do with music and the purpose of music, and what is the subtext of music, if it exists at all. Why do people listen to music? And it's, yes, in order to feel better, to be re-energized, to feel at one with whoever you're listening with. Yeah. And I always thought that, you know, music was a shared experience. It certainly was when I was a kid, you know, right from very young. We were sharing records, and that's in a pre sort of iPod kind of era where people listen to music separately, and they go for a run and they do all this, and it's this sort of thing that music wasn't like a pill that you took separately in the morning and then you put it away. Music was this shared thing, and again this idea of the subtext of it, yes, to re-energize, make people feel better.
Your relationship with Joe and what that means to both of you comes out really, really strongly, and anyone that's not yet read the book, I don't think this is a plot spoiler, but it's a very happy ending. But what I wanted to ask you was, if we wind the clock back a bit,
sure,
and we go back to probably one of your darker periods, so 2007 to 2009. And I wanted to ask you in particular about the album Out of the Tunnel's Mouth, which is one of my favourites.
Right, yes.
Came out in 2009.
Yes.
I think at the time, you know, you were in a flat on your own and recording it on your own. I mean, what was that period like, and how did the music help you through that time?
Well, I believe I'd started it, and at some point I befriended, I mean, Chris Squire and I knew each other, and Chris asked me to be on an album of his, a Christmas album he was making, and I jumped at the chance, because I was starting to feel a bit isolated at that point, and so one thing led to another. He did some things for me, I did things for him, and it was very interesting with him. He responded very positively to any idea that was good, and very emotionally, and unlike Genesis, where there were a lot of great ideas kicking around, there was usually this repressed feeling. Now maybe that had been part of the background, and the schooling that they'd had, Charterhouse, where I suspect showing emotion was surplus to requirements a lot of the time.
Yeah.
I think when you are, on one hand, brutalised, on another, raised to rule, I think this does mess with the young head. Anyway, Chris had none of that. I got the feeling it was very much, working class background, etc. Chris was very responsive to ideas, and I could see that he was engaged with them. And so this was a great revalidation for me. And so he played on one or two of the solo things, and we had surplus, and we ended up making an album called Squire and Hackett.
Yeah.
And I had great fun doing that. Again, it was an album. It was a problem with my studio about the ownership of it was being disputed, whilst there were various things going on with ex-partners.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, I'll just record at home. I'll just get on with that, and we'll do it in miniature. And Chris said, because you can these days, that's what you can do. So, we used amp simulation and all that kind of stuff. And it was a great period. It was really done in two halves. First half seemed to be going great guns, and then Chris decided to relocate back to the States, where Scotland, his wife, although she was born in Scotland, was very much an American. And so he relocated to Phoenix. And then when he came back a few times, we concentrated on finishing the thing. But it was a great experience. It was very different to working with anyone else. It seemed to me that the way he worked and the way we did together, the team that had Roger King, myself, and Chris, it seemed as if we were working on a tune, if anyone had an idea, the song just got longer in order to incorporate that idea. And so I realised how these many variations on the Yes songs worked, whereas Genesis was much more of a contest. This bit is better than this bit. It's not quite, I'm the king of the castle, but someone would say, well, that's not as strong as this, and I think we should do this, and I think we should do that. But it didn't really encapsulate fully what everyone was capable of at that moment in time. Hugely creative, but the machinery worked in a different way. It wasn't competitive. It was cooperative.
Yeah.
The best of Genesis, of course, is immensely cooperative, as you can imagine. But this thing with Chris was a bit of an eye opener to me, because I thought, here's this world class player and band leader, and he works this way. And
but Steve, if I could ask you about a couple of tracks in particular.
Sure.
So Far on the Moon, which is one of my all-time favourites of yours, and Emerald and Ash, and I picked those two out because there's an element of rawness about some of the lyrics on that album.
Yes.
Was this a cathartic experience for you? Was it your kind of like face value equivalent, or if I could call it that?
It's funny, I hadn't thought about face value, but I think there are aspects of that, and it was cathartic, and I think there's some beauty in there, and there's some strength in there. And there's some delicacy, if I can say that about my own stuff. And I also had a further link to Genesis, which was Anthony Phillips, who agreed to play on a couple of tracks.
Well, he was on Emerald and Ash, wasn't he?
He's on Emerald and Ash,
Yeah.
and I think he's on Sleeper as
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
So we did, one or two things together, and that was very nice because we're friends, although we've never officially been in Genesis at the same time. Nonetheless, I sensed that had we been in Genesis at the same time, there would have been this totally democratic way of working that
Yes.
was common to working with Chris. I mean, I think it's very difficult because, if you're lucky, a band will have one genius. If you're lucky enough, like the Beatles, to have arguably three, and George Martin as Beatles number
5, yeah.
5 and 6, what am I trying to say here? It's
a crowded place, wasn't it?
It is a crowded place, and the pressures can be enormous, and you find yourself trying very, very hard to write something of worth and relevance, not just for the band, but something that might last beyond that. I know we all felt that pressure, and you knew that each of these guys were capable of leading the charge themselves.
Yes.
So,
although very different commercial success as we saw with the solo projects. So
yeah, it's a very strange thing. It doesn't seem to be any accident that each of them had recurrent success, which was pretty rare. And a friend, Nigel Pearce, who's a DJ from Norfolk, says he swears he's got a tape of John Lennon. It was an interview that he did in Florida, saying he considered that Genesis were true sons of the Beatles.
Okay.
True sons of the Beatles.
That's a high compliment.
That's a very high compliment. That comes from the top. So anything that's in that time frame, I consider it to be a very high value indeed, and I refuse to see it as an abandoned place. And I've tried my damnedest, and it's not over yet, to present the best of what that band is or was capable of. So that's my take on it.
Yeah.
Politics free, just the best music. That's the way I see it.
So I want to ask you a bit about some of that period, and Watcher we'll talk about in a second. Just before we get on to that, Out of the Tunnel's Mouth for me sparked a run of a string of some very, very strong material, arguably some of your strongest ever material. At what point did you realise you were in a blue period and you were really producing something that was going to stand the test of time?
You could say no one really knows in terms of audience response or how something's going to do in the marketplace. But I think that the true currency of a song is how much it moves you personally and spiritually and all the rest. Is it a real song? Isn't it? What did you write it for? What were the motivations? Does it excite you? Does it move you in whatever way? And the moving music doesn't have to be Tchaikovsky.
Yes.
Although I find that very moving. It can be heavy metal. It can be. Again, I have to quote Joe. We were playing some Deep Purple yesterday in the car. Deep Purple live in Japan, and she said, I so much prefer this, she said, to, technically driven jazz. She said, she'll say anything that's got some real emotion to it, whether it's folk music with real passion, or this proto heavy metal stuff that's got real passion, fine by her. And of course, there's a world of music in there and different schools to say that. But I think for her, it doesn't have to be, or it's better if it's not merely technically competent. And I think that a lot of musicians do fall back on technique. whoever said that musicians often start off with passion and end up with technique is very, 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 very right. Unless you're displaying your technique for all it's worth and you're enjoying it.
Mm-hmm.
You're not just doing it because you can, but because those salvos relate to your 18-year-old self.
Yes.
When you were a kid. I had this feeling that when I was listening to Surfing with the Alien, that I thought, yeah, this feels like what I used to do in my bedroom when I was 18.
Yeah.
These same licks, and I understand it. The idea of absolutely full on and
Yeah.
no holds barred. You're playing to the maximum of your ability, flat out, and it's a fugue in the wider sense of the word. Of you're in a spell of it,
Yeah.
and at the end of it, yeah, it's cathartic as anything. You should be completely exhausted and gone. And I'm still very drawn to those aspects of that music can do that. Although I realise that jazzers will probably have, more knowledge of chords and I think it's because when it's acoustic, or if a jazz man is playing with a jazz tone, it's not screaming. It might not be bending a lot of notes. There might not be a lot of vibrato. It can be extremely fluent. But it's literally going up and down. Proficiency here, proficiency there. But for me, I've got to hold a note and torture it. It's got to be that in between,
Yeah.
the Keystone Cops runs. And I call them salvos because I know that a lot of people do think of, guitars as the sort of machine gun equivalent. And I understand that, with the tapping technique.
But Steve, if we just stick with the emotional side of it,
Yes,
which, I mean, your technical
certainly.
prowess has been evident ever since, the very first album, Nursery Crime, wasn't it? The first Genesis album that you did. When you said in your book towards the end, you said that you finally felt that you were at home, you finally felt that you'd arrived. So you talked about the fact you've got this balance now between, recreating, not recreating as in absolutely faithfully recreating, but effectively paying homage to, if that's the right expression, to the powerful Genesis period that you were a central part of, and your solo stuff. And you felt now you clearly were expressing that you've got that balance now.
Yeah.
When did that suddenly kind of fall into place?
Well, it's a funny thing because these Genesis Revisited things have been getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and tours have been getting longer and longer and longer, and it's been marvellous, the fact that I was able to do that. But at the same time, as I started to do that, so the album started to chart again.
Yes.
And so solo albums have been doing very well all over the world. And it's a funny thing, isn't it? I suspect promoters want one thing, but fans possibly want something else. And they say, oh, I wish you were doing more of your solo stuff. So gradually it's getting to the point where just having done the whole of Foxtrot, or kicked it off in this country, and done a comparably long solo set before it, the balance was complete, if you like. So it's lovely for me to know that
And both stack up
both-
against each other incredibly well. I mean,
I've
the
tried to do
reception
that.
you get for your solo set,
Yeah.
I think is as warm and as powerful. Certainly, Hammersmith was as powerful as it was for the Foxtrot stuff. Obviously, people have got a soft spot
Yes,
for Foxtrot, because it might have been the
course.
first album they got into. But
absolutely. Yeah.
Shadow the
Yeah.
Hierophant
Yes.
never fails to deliver, does it?
Well, part of that was written during the Foxtrot sessions. That's the funny thing. So
Yeah,
something about that year, 72, and
The magic dust was being
Mike-
sprinkled, was
Mike
it?
Rutherford. Well, I think so. Yeah, and it was there was some wonderful melotronic and therefore orchestral in spirit things that were coming out of that time, and
of course, Watch of the Skies,
yeah, the
heavy on the
majesty of yes,
Mellotron, which I
yes,
gather I didn't realise until I read your book that apparently you were the instigator of the Mellotron when you went to see King Crimson. Is that right?
yeah. Well, I'd wanted
I was assumed it was Tony, but it was you that
I'd
apparently brought it.
well I'd wanted Genesis to get a Mellotron, and so for the first 6 months we didn't have one, or so it seemed. Actually, maybe I've lost count here. January, February, March, April, May, June. Yeah, by then, I'd been banging on about getting a Mellotron, and then Fred Munt, who worked with Charisma, he may have been label boss at that time, said, "Oh, I've just heard, boys, that King Crimson are selling one of their Mellotrons. Are you interested?" Am I interested? Yes. So Tony and I went to see Crimson, who were rehearsing in a little cafe off Fulham Palace Road, in the basement, in the bowels of the earth, dark, dank place. And they seem to have 3 Mellotrons dotted around.
So I've only ever seen 2 Mellotrons in the flesh. I saw one at Echo Zoo Studios in Bournemouth.
Right.
And Ant Phillips, I don't know if he's still got it, but Ant Phillips used to have one in his attic.
Right. So this was a Mark II, the same model that the Beatles used on Strawberry Fields Forever.
Okay.
And straight away, Tony started mixing the strings and the brass together. He hadn't quite incorporated the bass fact, which was from the left-hand manual. The English accordion provided the bass on that introduction to Watch for the Sky. But that sound was being born straight away. That mixture of brass and string. The brass is very, because the sounds of the Mellotron are distorted. The brass is it's very full on. It's
harsh, maybe.
It's very harsh.
Yeah.
It's not a dynamic instrument. It's either on or it's off. But by the time it's tarted up, as John Aycock used to call it, my late great friend, if you tart them up, you get a wonderful sound like on Epitaph, King Crimson's Epitaph. That to me sounded wonderfully well recorded and well played. And again, I have to mention Ian MacDonald. If not for Ian, I think I wouldn't have been so enamoured with the properties, the possibilities of the Mellotron. It was enormous.
Very temperamental though on the road, I believe.
Yeah. So
and why was that? Was something to do with the technology? Was it?
Well, yeah. I mean, it is mechanical technology. It's tapes are rotating, and they can lose oxide, and so therefore they distort, and when they're being carried around, you can imagine the condensation factor can make them distort further, and sometimes they will stick and not work at all. So
so were there any disasters in the early Genesis days?
Many disasters, and yeah, I mean, we will be performing to 22,000 people in Rome, and the worst moment was always, is the Mellotron going to work? The opening note, is it going to work? Yes, it did, and it sounds glorious, and we've made it to the end of the intro without any screw-ups, and
sounds a bit like the Firth of Fifth intro where everyone in the crowd's holding their breath.
Yes.
Actually, Roger, I've never seen him mess that up, but I've seen quite a few tribute bands where
it's not
there's been a few goes at that one.
It's not an easy piece to play, I think your nerves could get the better of you there. It's a complex piece, and again, we're talking about Tony and the things that he did, and so I always loved the things that he came up with for Mellotron. Fountain of Salmacis, absolutely glorious. Just the keyboard work alone, it's worth its weight in gold. Many other things. Bits of the Lamb, so many, and I'm missing out on all sorts of things. Fly on a Windshield,
Yeah, yeah.
and you realise that really, in spirit, Tony was a classical composer, although he might take issue with that. Working in a rock band.
Well, he's done a number of classical albums, of course,
Well, he
in
has.
his own
He
right,
has,
as
he
have you,
has. Yes, yeah,
of course.
yeah.
One of my favourite, Metamorphosis, which I
Glad you like that.
absolutely love, That Vast Life.
Right. Yes,
Wow.
that's a long piece.
It is, but it's got this
Yes.
refrain that just keeps coming back and then disappearing and coming back. So it's a very moving piece of music.
I hoped it would be. I hoped it would be like a life where you always return to. You're always completing the circle, and it gets reminded every time. I think life is a bit like that, isn't it? It's like you leave behind so much when you grow up, but there's something intrinsically you that remains, and occasionally you feel that circle closes. I certainly felt that when we were doing at Hammersmith the other night, and my mother came forward, and
that was a lovely moment,
and it was incredibly moving for me. The room just seemed to be filled with so much love and love for the music, and of course, love between mother and son, and the band. I'm very proud of the band, very proud of the music, the Genesis music, and all the other incarnations of bands that built the so-called solo stuff. But they were all different, bands at different times.
I mean, you talked about we talked a lot about the emotional side of music, which, when we first met, I remember we had a conversation around. We talked about the Beatles. And I said to you that, for me, the Beatles are an amazing group, but didn't move me emotionally. And then we talked about, the time in your life when your emotions are starting to come to the fore.
Right, yes.
And of course, one of the very first albums I heard that really kind of went, wow, was A Trick of the Tail. So it's a place in time.
Yes.
In a sense.
Yes.
So you recreating, I shouldn't use the word recreate, but you reviving and putting your own stamp on those early Genesis albums.
Yeah.
Does it take you back to those moments in time or not?
Well, it does, and at the same time, I allow it to take me somewhere else, so that if we've got additional woodwind or brass or an occasional orchestra, I have this idea that music should continue to evolve, maybe in small increments, but somehow it doesn't have to be slavishly done in the way that, say, for instance, Mellotron. Now, Mellotron strings. I did some work for Mellotron in recent years, and I gave them some notes that they could use for the Mellotron, for the new breed of Mellotron.
Right.
And they said, how should we pay you? And I said, would you give me the Mellotron strings before they go through the Mellotron?
Oh, okay. So you got the input.
So it was 3 women in a bedroom somewhere in New York or New York State in 1953 that provided these samples that showed up on everything from Moody Blues to Michael Jackson, and so there we are. You see, so we've got the cleanest Mellotron strings in the business. So we mix that with the distorted brass via the Mellotron. You see, it's a sample of a sample of a sample.
Yes.
All this, and then Roger mixes some model samples with that modern samples to smooth it.
Yeah.
And so when you hear that, I think, magnificent sound that comes out, you've got Mellotron Plus. You're hearing that, and I was keen on some extra reverb being put on that as well, so that it never sounded dry, but it was always as symphonic as a pair of hands can do on that. I still think it's a fantastic piece of music, and it's a sci-fi soundtrack it's a journey, it's a film for the ear, it's all of those things. When music tells a story and it works that well, when you're caught up in it, as you said, you know, a trick of the tail, the idea of, you know, dance on a volcano, and when you can picture the volcano and when the molten rock does that thing, but the notes become that, and you're painting that picture, or you're
or
trying
for that
to
matter, to be honest, Entangled, very different. I mean, very acoustic, but the theme of the lyrics and the music just goes so well together.
Well, I'm glad you like that.
It takes you to a place.
Yes, yeah.
Because it's really one of your babies, wasn't it?
It was,
Entangled.
yes. And I remember Phil saying, when I first presented the idea, he said, "Oh, this has got a Mary Poppins feel. I like this.
Never thought of that.
Why
As
don't
Mary
we do
Poppins.
this? Mary Poppins, you know,
Okay.
over the rooftops and houses." I think
okay.
he'd seen that.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
So we weren't immune to Disney or cartoons or musicals or anything.
It wasn't just about hogweeds and...
No, it wasn't. It wasn't just about hogweeds. I think it was about all sorts of things. It was about the preposterous and the obscurantist, but it was also occasionally about love songs. It was certainly about telling stories. It was certainly about humour. There was a bit of panto in there. Willow Farm, Pete dancing about with a flower mask.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it's as much Bill and Ben as it is high art. Do you know what I mean?
I do. I do. But it works.
It worked. All of those things, and I think all the reasons that we loved the Beatles was the sheer breadth of the work, and hopefully music should have that, and
pushing the boundaries too.
Always having to remind myself that music can be this. You don't just have to be a guitarist. You know, you can be all sorts of things. You could be an arranger, you could be an impresario, you could just be bringing two people together that might do something because you think the idea might be worth pursuing. Like an idea like The Memory of Myth on Under a Mediterranean Sky. The lovely string theme on that Joe wrote, and Roger orchestrated it. And I just sat back and I thought, wow, wonderful.
One of those moments.
One of those
and
moments.
You know you've got something,
Yeah. And so I'm sort of midwife to that, not the mother or the father.
That's a lovely description.
Yeah, midwife. I think sometimes to be the glue or to be the midwife, or just the right word at a certain point, it can be as effective. Yeah. I think that was my... You see, I'd seen the way that Pete Sinfield had operated with King Crimson, and I guess it's because it seemed as if he noticed all the things that no one else had time to notice because they were too busy playing the parts. But somebody who stands back and says, "Oh, yes, well, live we can perhaps stick these drums through a or say, you know what I mean, through a ring modulator and see what that produces."
Yeah.
Yeah, why not? You know, and that's not usually something that a drummer's going to think of. Unless maybe he did, Ian Wallace at the time. But I remember seeing him at the Fairfields Hall and thinking, well, that's not a usual drum solo, is it? Yes. It's being treated. And I noticed when he was talking to John Wetton, late great pal, and I keep mentioning late great pals because, you know, one can't be in the room without, you know, standing on the shoulders of giants and rubbing shoulders with brothers who've now fallen.
So, Steve, in terms of looking ahead, you're still touring with Foxtrot. I think you're going to mainland Europe with that. You've got the seconds out, US leg as well. So
still doing that.
Your schedule for 2023 already looks pretty packed. What about the writing and recording side? Have you got anything lined up?
Yes, I do. I've got 2 or 3 songs done. One of which is quite long. It may even get longer. Who knows? You know, we might have another Suppers Ready there by the time we finish. But whether people are still in the same position that they were, you know, people that were locked away in schools and said that, you know, Genesis was a safety valve for them, or it was, you know, part of one's dream life.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether I have an audience that's that young to be able to absorb that. So I've tended to do shorter tunes.
Mm-hmm.
But I do make albums rather than a collection of songs that are all potential hit singles. I don't believe that that is really a course of action that is open to me at this moment in time.
So is this a rock album then, or a classical album?
This is a rock album.
Okay.
I mean, I think at this point in life, the only way I'm probably going to have another hit single is if I go and form a band with Bob Dylan and and Eric Clapton and you know, and I'll make the tea. But you know what I'm saying? Yeah, you can have that sort of the travelling Wilburys effect and all of that. You know, that although it was very low key, it was still corporate in its. Yeah, I suspect driven by the guys themselves rather than the idea of. I can't imagine that came out of a boardroom.
Yeah. But the album, Steve, we were talking about is there a theme to that album, or have you just
there is a theme. There is a theme.
Are you able to share that with us, or?
Well, we're batting this concept backwards and forwards the whole time, so we're hoping that it'll have a theme, but that it also parallels one's own life at the same time.
Oh, okay.
So that
sounds interesting.
So that there might be some kind of parallel myth or story going on that we can, but we have to go further to see whether that'll hang, because they have to work as separate songs, I think. You know, possibly the greatest concept album of all time is Sgt. Pepper, but I think that's because the concept was so loose, the idea of them being different people and lots of third person stuff going on, whereas they'd been very much direct first person. I, she loves you, I, she, it.
Yes.
Suddenly it's he, they, etc. I think that worked very well, and of course the fact that you could down tools for a few bars and the orchestra take over, even if it's only in pastiche form. I think that it's extremely clever, and I think that ELO did something, you know, comparable with the use of the Hollywood choir wafting in from time to time, and you knew that you couldn't take it seriously, but nonetheless, it was like a very good poem in a way.
So new album being worked on. What's next from a Genesis Revisited point of view? Have you got any plans for a nursery crime or something like that, or not?
Well, I don't know whether there's another Genesis Revisited album in me. I would have to choose things that are non-favourites, and all the songs that maybe hadn't quite come up to scratch, turn them into, you know, glorious things. That the songs that were more sketchy, perhaps all those Cinderella songs would be the ones that would deserve to go to the ball if it had a sufficiently designer gown or two. You know what I mean? So you know that the approach that I had to for Absent Friends when I redid it with Colin Blunstone and the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra was the idea of, let's give it orchestral clothes, let's dress these old ladies up in a way that and I completely took liberty with the song because it was largely mine, and I can well imagine people turning around saying, well, actually I prefer the the simple thing with just the two 12 strings and a bit of electric piano, etc., and I can understand if someone says that's absolutely fine. It's like Dylan, The Birds, or Peter, Paul and Mary. It's what's the sketch and what's the portrait, and at what point do you stop? But in addition to whether there would be yet another one of those things,
from a touring point of view,
I may have. I don't know if there's another complete Genesis album that is worthy of doing in its entirety?
Oh, we could debate that one.
We could debate that one, and I'm anxious to hear your. I think you should start that debate immediately and tell me what you think.
Well, I love Nursery Crime
Right?
as an album.
Okay.
Obviously, there are some songs in particular that
Yeah.
I would single out. Fountain of Some Artists.
Yeah.
Musical Box, of course, that's been done
Yep.
a lot. Wind and Wuthering is a favourite of mine. So for me, I think both those
albums
played end to end.
Yeah.
I think you'd be selling out the same way you're selling out with Foxtrot.
Right. Yes.
But that's a personal view, obviously.
And then I would have to sort of wade through the Harold the Barrels, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, exactly. So
and how do you make that? How do you make that work?
I'm sure Nad could make that work.
Well, yes, but how do you make it work? How do you make it work instrumentally? What's the new spin?
Well,
that you
you're
can put
asking
on
the
that?
wrong person on that one, I'm afraid.
Maybe it has to go a bit more trad jazz or something like that. I don't know.
Well, let's stick with Wind and Wuthering
something.
then, because you've done most of that already.
I have done most of Wind and Wuthering. Yeah, I think that's possibly stronger in its entirety.
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
But again, that's...
I have done it, and I've done Wuthering Nights, and so whether or not that would, bring them out, or whether it would be better to have, a selection of moments that people think are
funny
are the best.
But it's funny, Steve, because I mean, obviously, as Genesis fans, we love the fact you're doing some of the Genesis classics and you're putting your own stamp on them, as we've discussed. But there's an element of me that does get a little frustrated because, with something like, for example, the Foxtrot, you had the Hackett highlights, very much your big numbers, but very little from your recent run of albums,
right? Yes.
Because you can't fit them in.
Yes.
So in a sense, the success of the Genesis Revisited has squeezed out some of the recent solo stuff, which is some of your strongest. So,
yeah. Well, perhaps you see. Excuse me. So many things are untested now. For instance, this little old album here. For me, the Surrender of Silence. Now, for me, the flagship track was and is Natalia, because...
Which I've not heard you play. I think you've only played 2 tracks on this album.
No,
live.
I've not played it live, and I'm saying it's because, we had symphonic proportions plus on that.
Yes.
I mean, it's like orchestra plus film soundtrack.
That's true.
Meets this, meets that, meets rock, etc. If I could do something like that, and I know that I have to twist Roger's arm, because he says he doesn't really want to do anything that he can't actually play. So
as opposed to the backing tapes.
Mind you, when you set him a task like that, he invariably does something quite extraordinary.
So Roger, if you're listening to this, there you go.
Yeah, there you go. So there's that, and there's relaxation music for sharks.
Yeah,
which is an instrumental, but it's basically orchestral. It's really a film. I haven't done the film for it yet, but maybe there will be at some point.
There you go.
And so I go back to those things. What else? I mean, sometimes when we're playing the album and it's just playing between the 2 sets, and I'm hearing something like, I think, oh, that sounds good. What's that one? That's Scorched Earth. That sounds pretty good too.
Yeah.
I just don't know, because people haven't had the familiarity of that, whereas they were familiar with the other stuff. Devil's Cathedral goes down very well.
Well, it's
an all-out thrash. Really.
I mean, it really is a kind of, start with the organ. It's just kind of, whoa.
It works theatrically.
It does work theatrically.
And it's always completely improvised. What Rob and Roger play together is completely improvised. All that's agreed is that they play octatonics or diminished runs or something close. And They follow each other. They listen to each other.
Okay.
They respond to each other's dynamics, and it's like a new kind of jazz, because you get the sacred instrument, the sacred organ, and the profane sax, and they're working together. It's what classical music should evolve to, and it's what jazz should evolve to, and it's what rock should evolve to. But it takes intelligence and panache and all sorts of things, and I let them do that on their own.
Yeah.
I don't have the whole band doing that, because I know that those twin colours complement each other.
Yeah.
I think, and it can be rasping, or it can be very, restrained, and I wish I had enough words to describe what that does to me, but all I did was set it in motion, because I heard them messing around with something one day, and I said, "What are you doing? How are you doing that?" And they said, "Oh, it's just blah 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 blah. It's only this." I said, "Never mind, only this.
Yeah.
Let's do it. Let's record it. Let's run with it.
Yeah.
Let's get you guys doing this."
Yeah.
And again, here's me as proud midwife.
Yeah.
To a moment that might never have happened.
Yeah.
The rest of the song, yes, I'm writing.
Okay.
But, that, and in a way, it's got a link to Genesis. I was thinking of some of the moments of Dancing with the Moonlit Night that take off like a rocket, and I thought, if we can do something that takes off like a rocket, and a story, it's in a Genesis tradition in the best sense, that there's a protagonist, it's a story, it's about something, it's about ambition, it's Alfred Hitchcock meets, it meets a bit of blues, bit of jazz, bit of
It's got
gothic,
everything,
gothic.
hasn't it? Absolutely.
Yeah, that's it. With the idea of, if it has everything, it has everything but romance.
This interview with Steve Hackett is brought to you by Make a Difference with Records. We are a vinyl charity store based in Godalming, and we support the Surrey mental health charity Catalyst. Look out for our other podcasts, and you can follow us on Instagram under Make a Difference with Records, or on Twitter at Vinyl for Charity.